"I'm selling my little brother for $2,000. A 7-year-old girl made a shocking offer, but the truth behind it made everyone choke up. Before watching a touching and dramatic story, please comment and let us know where you are watching from. The rain had not stopped since dawn. It drizzled softly against the glass panes of St. Michael's Hospital, streaking the world outside in muted greys. Inside, the fluorescent lights buzzed faintly, casting a pale glow over the linoleum floors, where nurses moved in quiet urgency, their shoes clicking in rhythm with the beeping of distant monitors. Henry adjusted his ID badge as he walked down the hallway, still not entirely used to the feel of it against his chest. First week on the job, new city, new hospital, same weight of responsibility pressing against his shoulders. He wasn't sure if he belonged here yet. As he stepped into the hospital cafe for a break, the scent of burnt coffee barely registered. His mind was occupied, flipping through the mental list of cases he'd reviewed that morning. But before he could take his first sip, something outside the glass doors caught his attention. A child. She stood alone, just beyond the hospital's entrance, her small frame hunched slightly against the cold drizzle. She wasn't moving, wasn't fidgeting like most children did. Instead, she held a damp piece of cardboard in her hands, gripping it tightly, her fingers pressing against its edges like she was afraid it might disappear. Henry frowned, setting his coffee down. Something about the stillness of her posture unsettled him. He walked toward the entrance, the automatic doors sliding open with a faint hiss. The girl didn't react. Up close, she looked no older than 7, thin, pale, with dark, unkempt hair that clung to her forehead in damp strands. Her jacket was 2 sizes too big, the cuffs frayed, as if it had once belonged to someone else. Henry crouched down slightly to meet her eye level. "Hey there," he said, keeping his voice gentle. "Are you waiting for someone?" The girl finally looked up. Her eyes were dark and solemn, carrying a weight that no child should have to bear. She hesitated, then lifted the cardboard toward him. "Can you write something for me?" Henry blinked. The request was unexpected. "Depends," he said carefully. "What do you need me to write?" She hesitated again, then said, in a voice too steady for her small frame, "I'm selling my little brother for $2,000. For a moment, the rain seemed to fall in absolute silence. Henry stared at her, waiting for some sign that she was joking, that this was some sort of misunderstanding. But Sarah's face remained unreadable, her fingers gripping the cardboard tighter, as if bracing herself for his reaction. His throat felt dry. "Sweetheart," he said, carefully measuring his words. "Why would you want to write something like that?" Sarah exhaled slowly, as if she had been waiting for him to ask. "Because," she said simply, "it's the only way I can save him." Henry swallowed. "Save him from what?" She lifted her chin, unyielding. "From dying." Henry knelt down, keeping his voice steady despite the uneasy knot forming in his chest. "Tell me about your brother." Sarah hesitated, shifting her weight from one foot to the other, as if debating whether to trust him. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she spoke. "His name is Josh. He's 4. He's really sick." Her fingers curled slightly against the cardboard. "And I need $2,000 to take him to the hospital. If I sell him to a family that has money, maybe they can help him." Henry's heart clenched. "You don't have to sell your brother," he said gently. "But I don't have money," she said, her voice matter-of-fact, as if she had already accepted this as her reality. "And hospitals don't help for free." Henry inhaled sharply. He wanted to tell her she was wrong, that no child should have to think like this, that help was always available, but he knew better. Not every child had been given reasons to believe that. "Where is Josh now?" he asked. Sarah lifted a hand and pointed toward a small, sheltered corner near the emergency entrance. Henry followed her gaze, and his breath caught. Josh was curled up on a thin blanket, tucked into the farthest corner of the hospital's covered entrance. His tiny body shook with every breath. His skin was too pale, his lips tinged with blue, his face slick with sweat despite the cold air around him. Henry's instincts took over. He rushed forward, kneeling beside the boy. A fever, high and unchecked. His breathing was labored, his small chest rising and falling unevenly. Pneumonia, severe. Henry looked back at Sarah, who stood nearby, her arms wrapped around herself. How long has he been like this? Sarah shifted her weight again, staring at the wet pavement. A while, she said. I thought he'd get better, but it got worse. Henry exhaled, running a hand through his hair. We need to get him inside right now, he said firmly. But, Henry shook his head. No but. I'm a doctor and I can help him. But I need you to trust me. Sarah looked at Josh, then at Henry. She hesitated. Then, slowly, she nodded. Henry lifted Josh carefully, feeling the heat radiating off the boy's fragile body. He was too light, his limbs almost weightless in Henry's arms. Malnourished, weak. As he carried Josh through the hospital doors, he could feel Sarah's presence right behind him, small but unshaken, walking forward despite the fear in her eyes. Nurses turned their heads as Henry strode through the hallway, his voice calm but urgent. We need a pediatric bed, he called out. Get me oxygen, IV fluids, and a fever reducer, now. The medical team sprang into action, wheeling over a stretcher as Henry carefully placed Josh down. The beeping of monitors, the shuffle of nurses, the soft hiss of oxygen, everything blurred together. Sarah stood at the edge of the room, gripping her damp sleeves, her expression unreadable. Henry turned to her. Josh is going to be okay, he promised. Sarah blinked. Even if I can't pay? Henry knelt in front of her. You don't have to pay, he said firmly. He's my patient now. Sarah stared at him, her small fingers twisting into the fabric of her jacket. Why are you helping us? Henry softened. Because that's what family does. Sarah's lips parted slightly, as if she wanted to say something, but no words came. Instead, she just nodded, her small shoulders finally relaxing, just a little. Outside, the rain continued to fall, but this time it wasn't drowning something, it was washing something clean. The rain hadn't stopped. It lingered in the air, clinging to the windows of St. Michael's Hospital like a quiet reminder of the weight pressing down on the world outside. The city felt heavier beneath the grey sky, the wet pavement reflecting the pale glow of streetlights. Inside, the halls buzzed with their usual muted urgency. Nurses moving in quiet efficiency, the distant hum of conversations blending into the rhythmic beeping of monitors. But for Henry, the world had narrowed to just two figures. A 7-year-old girl standing in front of him, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, and a 4-year-old boy curled up in the corner of the emergency entrance, his tiny body struggling against an invisible enemy. Sarah led him to the place where Josh lay, her small footsteps quick, urgent, though her face remained unreadable. Henry's chest tightened when he finally saw the boy up close. Josh was motionless, his frail limbs curled inward as if trying to keep himself warm despite the fever burning beneath his skin. His cheeks were sunken, his lips dry and slightly parted, the sound of his breathing labored and shallow. His small fingers clutched at the fabric of a thin, worn-out blanket that barely covered him. It didn't take years of medical training to see the truth. This child was running out of time. Henry dropped to his knees beside him. How long has he been like this? His voice was calm, steady, but there was an edge beneath it that he couldn't quite suppress. Sarah knelt too, her hands tightening into small fists against her sides. A few days, she admitted. Maybe a week. Henry turned sharply to look at her, his stomach twisting. A week? Sarah flinched, her expression unreadable, but her fingers curled around the hem of her jacket, gripping it tightly. I tried to keep him warm, she said. I tried to get him food, but he kept getting worse. Henry forced himself to take a slow breath. This wasn't her fault, she was just a child, but the way she spoke, controlled, measured as if she had already prepared herself for the worst, told him that life had long forced her to grow up too fast. We need to get him inside, Henry said, his voice firm but gentle. Sarah hesitated. He's not. She bit her lip, shaking her head. They won't let him stay. I tried before, but they said I had to have a guardian, and I... Her voice cracked. Henry understood instantly. She had tried. She had begged. But without an adult to vouch for them, Josh had been turned away. His jaw tightened. Sarah. He met her eyes, making sure she was listening. I'm taking him in, right now. She stared at him. Even if we can't pay? Henry didn't blink. I'm not asking for payment. For the first time since he met her, Sarah's face broke. just for a second. Her lips trembled, her small shoulders shook slightly, but she quickly bit the emotion back, refusing to let herself cry. She nodded. Henry lifted Josh carefully, feeling the heat radiating from the child's fevered skin. He weighed almost nothing, his body light, too fragile. Sarah followed close behind as Henry carried her brother through the hospital doors. The shift was immediate. The warm air inside contrasted sharply with the bitter cold of the outside. A nurse at the reception desk looked up, her eyes widening at the sight of Henry carrying a child in his arms. "I need a pediatric bed prepped now," Henry instructed, his voice calm but urgent. The nurse hesitated for only a second before nodding. Within moments, a stretcher was wheeled over, and Henry gently placed Josh down. Sarah stayed close, gripping the side of the stretcher as if afraid he would disappear if she let go. Henry turned to a passing nurse. "Page Dr. Lively and get a respiratory therapist down here. We're looking at severe pneumonia, possible sepsis." The nurse nodded and hurried off. Another nurse moved toward Josh with an oxygen mask, but Sarah tensed, her instincts screaming to protect him. Henry placed a hand on her shoulder. "Firm, steady, they're going to help him," he said quietly. Sarah's grip loosened, but she didn't let go. The next hour blurred into a series of medical procedures and quiet reassurances. Josh was placed on oxygen support, an IV inserted into his tiny arm to deliver fluids and antibiotics. His fever was dangerously high, his body weak from prolonged malnutrition, but his vitals, though unsteady, held on. Henry stood by, watching closely, every decision calculated. Sarah sat near the hospital bed, unmoving. At some point, Henry crouched beside her. "He's in good hands now," he said. Sarah didn't look at him immediately. When she finally did, her voice was quiet. "You promise?" Henry didn't promise things he couldn't guarantee, but he nodded. "I'll do everything I can." She seemed to accept that. For the first time, her fingers loosened their death grip on her sleeves. Hours passed. At some point, Sarah fell asleep, curled up in the chair beside Josh's bed. Henry watched them, exhaustion pressing against his own bones. A nurse approached him quietly. "I saw you listed Josh as a family member in the system," she said, keeping her voice low. "That means he's covered under your medical privileges." Henry nodded. "Is there a problem?" The nurse hesitated. "No, it's just..." She glanced at the sleeping Sarah. "You didn't have to do that." Henry looked at the little girl curled up beside her brother. "Yes, I did." The nurse didn't argue. It was past midnight when Sarah stirred awake. She blinked against the dim hospital lighting, then turned quickly to check on Josh. The boy's breathing was steadier now, his tiny chest rising and falling with more ease. The fever had broken slightly, though he was still weak. Sarah exhaled slowly, relief washing over her face. Then she looked up at Henry. "You really did help him?" Henry offered a small smile. "Doctors tend to do that." Sarah was quiet for a moment, as if processing something too big for words. Then, with hesitation, with vulnerability, with something that felt like trust, she whispered, "Thank you." Henry simply nodded. Sarah turned back toward her brother, leaning in close to him. She reached for his small hand, wrapping it in both of hers. Her voice was barely above a breath. "You're going to be okay now." And for the first time in a long time, she let herself believe it. The hospital never truly slept. Even in the quiet hours of the night, there was always the distant hum of machines, the soft murmur of nurses exchanging reports, the occasional beeping of a heart monitor. Time moved differently here, slow, measured, detached from the outside world. Henry sat in the dim glow of the pediatric ward, elbows resting on his knees, watching over a small boy connected to oxygen and IV fluids. The steady rhythm of Josh's breathing was reassuring but fragile, like glass that might crack under the slightest pressure. Across from him, curled up in the stiff hospital chair, was Sarah. She hadn't moved in hours. She refused to leave. No matter how many times a nurse offered her a more comfortable place to rest, she just shook her head. "I'm not going anywhere," she said, voice hoarse from exhaustion. Henry had seen resilience before, but this was different. She sat with her arms wrapped around her knees, her gaze locked on Josh's face as if willing him to stay with her. She was just a child, but there was something ancient in the way she carried herself, something that made Henry's chest ache. Eventually he sighed, stood up and disappeared down the hall. When he returned, he placed a folded blanket around her shoulders. Sarah flinched, surprised by the warmth. "I'm fine," she muttered. "You don't look fine," Henry said simply, settling into the chair beside her. She hesitated, then pulled the blanket tighter around herself, as if she didn't want to need it but couldn't let go of it either. Minutes passed. Then, quietly, so softly he almost didn't hear, she asked, "Do you think I made the right choice?" Henry turned his head slightly. Sarah's voice was steady, but there was an edge to it, like she was afraid of the answer. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked at Josh, the way his small fingers curled slightly against the sheets, his chest rising and falling in a rhythm that had been much more uncertain hours ago. "You did what any big sister would do," Henry finally said. "You did what you had to." Sarah pressed her lips together. She looked down at her hands, tracing patterns onto the blanket with her fingertips. But what if it wasn't enough? Henry exhaled slowly. He had seen this kind of doubt before, the kind that settled in the spaces between exhaustion and love, where every decision felt like a gamble, where the weight of responsibility pressed too hard. "Sometimes," he said carefully, "doing your best doesn't feel like enough. But that doesn't mean it wasn't the right thing to do." Sarah didn't answer right away. Instead, she let out a small breath, barely a whisper. "My mum used to say that too." Henry stilled. The air in the room shifted. Henry glanced at Sarah, but she wasn't looking at him anymore. Her gaze was distant, like she was somewhere else entirely. "She died a few months ago," Sarah said, her voice quiet, even. Too even. Henry said nothing. He just let her speak. "She got sick," Sarah continued, folding her hands together as if she could hold on to something that wasn't there anymore. "At first, she said it was just a cough, but it got worse. She blinked, but she didn't cry. She tried to keep working, but she was so tired all the time. Then one day she just didn't wake up." Silence settled between them. Henry clenched his hands together. He knew grief. He knew how it hollowed people out, left them with nothing but the shape of what used to be. And yet he had never seen a child carry it quite like this, so quietly, so carefully, like she had been holding her breath ever since. "I called for help," Sarah said after a while. "They took her away, but they wouldn't let us stay in the apartment after that." Henry's stomach tightened. No family, no home, just two children left to fend for themselves. "How long were you on your own?" Sarah hesitated, then, barely audible, "Too long." Henry ran a hand through his hair. He wanted to say something, something that could make this easier, something that could fill the empty spaces where her childhood should have been. But what do you say to a child who has already learned how cruel the world can be? Sarah pulled the blanket tighter around herself. "I wasn't supposed to let it get this bad," she muttered. Henry shook his head. "This isn't your fault." She frowned, as if she didn't believe him. "I should have figured something out sooner," she whispered. "You're 7, Henry said softly. "You shouldn't have had to figure out anything." Her fingers curled into the fabric of the blanket, but she didn't argue. Instead, she looked at Josh again, and for the first time she allowed herself to look tired. The night stretched on. At some point, Sarah finally succumbed to exhaustion, her small frame leaning slightly against the armrest of the chair. Henry watched as her breathing evened out, as the tension in her body slowly unwound. If only for a little while, he let out a quiet breath, rubbing the bridge of his nose. This was more than just a medical case. This was a child with no safety net, a little boy who had almost died because there was no one left to fight for him, and a 7-year-old girl who had spent too long believing she was the only one left to fight at all. Henry leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes for a moment. He wasn't sure what came next, but he knew one thing. They weren't going to be alone anymore. Not if he had anything to do with it. Outside, the rain had softened into a light drizzle, and for the first time in a long time, it didn't feel so heavy. The rain had stopped sometime in the early morning, leaving behind a mist that clung to the windows of St. Michael's Hospital. The world outside was painted in muted greys and silvers, the city still damp from the storm that had passed. But inside, the air was thick with something heavier than humidity, something unseen, yet suffocating. Henry had spent the night checking on Josh, watching as his fever gradually subsided, his breathing no longer as labored as it had been. The boy was still weak, but for the first time since arriving at the hospital he was stable. Sarah had stayed by his bedside, only sleeping when exhaustion forced her to. Henry had let her be, but now as he walked back into the pediatric ward with a fresh cup of coffee, he noticed something was wrong. Sarah stood by Josh's bed, her small fingers curled into the sheets, her shoulders rigid. Her entire body seemed to lock in place, her breathing shallow and uneven. Henry followed her gaze, and his stomach clenched. A man stood at the doorway, well-dressed, dark suit, crisp shirt, an expression that teetered between charm and calculation. His hair was neatly combed, his shoes polished, his features arranged into something that almost looked like concern, but not quite. There was something off about the way he carried himself, too smooth, too rehearsed. Henry set his coffee down. "Can I help you?" His voice was steady, controlled. The man barely spared him a glance. His attention was locked onto Sarah, his lips curving into a practiced smile. "Sweetheart," he said, taking a slow step forward. "It's been a long time." Sarah flinched, recoiling so violently that her back hit Josh's bed, her hands gripping the metal railing as if it could anchor her. Josh stirred but didn't wake. Sarah's lips barely moved, but Henry still heard it. "He's lying." Henry took a measured step forward, subtly positioning himself between Sarah and the stranger. "And you are—" The man turned his gaze to Henry for the first time, his expression shifting into something almost amused, as if Henry was nothing more than an inconvenience. "Stephen Caldwell," he said smoothly. "I'm their father." Silence. The words hung in the air, heavy, unnatural. Henry felt Sarah's small fingers tug at his sleeve, her grip tight. "He's lying," she whispered again, her voice more frantic this time. "Just wants money." Henry didn't look at her, but he felt her words settle deep into his chest. Stephen sighed, shaking his head as if deeply wounded. "Sarah, sweetheart," he said, voice dipping into a familiar kind of manipulation, the kind that had been used on people for years and perfected with time. "I know I wasn't there before, but I'm here now. I want to take you and Josh home." Sarah's hands trembled, her nails digging into the fabric of Henry's sleeve. "Home?" she repeated, her voice barely more than a breath. "We don't have a home. You lost it, you drank it away." Henry felt something icy spread through him. Stephen didn't flinch, but Henry noticed the way his jaw tightened for half a second before he forced himself to smile again. "That's not true," Stephen said. "Things were hard before, but I've changed. I've cleaned up. I've got a steady job." Sarah shook her head sharply. "No, you haven't," she snapped, her voice rising. "You just want the money." Stephen's composure slipped, just for a moment. His eyes darkened, his smile tightening. "You don't know what you're talking about, little girl," he said, his voice quieter, sharper. Henry saw the shift immediately. The performance was cracking. Henry took a step closer, his presence suddenly more assertive. "Sarah," he said gently, not looking away from Stephen, "why don't you tell me exactly why you don't want to go with him?" Sarah gripped Josh's bed rail tighter, but she didn't hesitate. "He used to hit my mum," she said, "all the time. When she tried to hide money for food, he'd take it. When she told him to stop gambling, he'd scream at her. And when she tried to leave, he hurt her so bad she couldn't move for days." Her voice trembled, but she pushed through. "And after she died," Sarah continued, "he didn't even care. He just kept drinking, kept playing cards with his friends, while me and Josh—" She stopped, her breath hitching. Josh stirred slightly, as if he could feel the tension even in sleep. Henry clenched his jaw. "You abandoned them," he said flatly, looking directly at Stephen. Stephen didn't blink. "I had my reasons," he said, his tone almost bored. "And it doesn't matter now. I'm here, aren't I?" Sarah shook her head again, her fists tightening. "He's only here because of the government money," she whispered to Henry. "Emily told me sick kids get more money if their parents take them back." Henry felt something snap inside him. Of course it wasn't about them, it was about what they were worth. Henry exhaled slowly, willing himself to stay calm. "Stephen," he said, carefully neutral, "let me be clear about something. If you want these kids back, you're going to have to go through legal channels. You don't just get to show up and claim them because it's convenient." Stephen's lips curled slightly, as if amused. "That's so?" Henry didn't look away. "That's so." Stephen let the silence stretch, weighing his options. Then, suddenly, he smiled. "All right," he said, smoothing out the sleeve of his suit. "If that's how you want to do it, I'll see you in court." He turned without another word, walking toward the exit with the same rehearsed elegance he had entered with. But before disappearing through the doors, he glanced back one last time. "See you soon, sweetheart," he murmured to Sarah. She shrank back instantly, pressing herself against Josh's bed, her face pale. Then he was gone. The room was silent. Sarah didn't move, didn't speak. Henry crouched beside her, keeping his voice gentle. "Hey," he said, "you're safe. He's not taking you anywhere." Sarah stared at the floor, her arms wrapping around herself. "Hem always wins," she whispered. "He always finds a way." Henry's jaw tightened. "Not this time," he said. Sarah finally looked up at him. "But he's your father, isn't he?" Henry exhaled slowly. "No," he said. "He's not your father. He's just the man who left you behind." Sarah stared at him as if trying to believe it. Then, for the first time in what felt like forever, she nodded. The rain started again outside, soft, steady, but this time it didn't feel like a storm waiting to happen. It felt like a battle waiting to be fought. The air inside St. Michael's Hospital had grown thick with an unspoken tension, an unease that lingered long after Stephen's departure. The storm he had promised wasn't just a threat. It was already forming. Henry could see it in Sarah's silence, in the way she traced invisible patterns on the hospital sheets, her mind somewhere far away. He could feel it in the way Josh clung to her, even in his fevered sleep, as if sensing the fragility of their safety. And he could hear it in Emily's voice, measured and careful, as she laid out the reality of their situation. Henry sat across from Emily Reyes, his oldest friend and one of the most dedicated social workers he had ever met. Her office was small, cluttered with case files and coffee-stained reports, the walls lined with pictures of children she had helped over the years. She leaned forward, hands folded on her desk, her expression serious. "This isn't going to be easy," she said. Henry exhaled, already expecting the worst. "Tell me." Emily rubbed her temple. "Legally, Stephen has rights. Unless there's undeniable proof that he's an unfit parent, the state will consider placing the kids back with him." Henry's jaw tightened. "You heard Sarah. You know what he's done." Emily nodded. "I believe her. But courts want evidence, not words." She paused. "And Stephen knows that." Henry ran a hand through his hair. "Then we get evidence." Emily sighed. "It's not that simple. If Stephen proves he has a stable income, a clean record, and no recent history of abuse, the system will lean in his favor. He's saying all the right things. He's claiming he's reformed, that he just wants to fix his mistakes. That's what the judge will see." Henry clenched his fists. "Then we prove it's a lie." Emily studied him. "And how exactly do you plan to do that?" Sarah hadn't spoken much since Stephen left. She sat on the edge of Josh's hospital bed, her fingers playing with the hem of her oversized jacket, her eyes locked on the window as if she could see something no one else could. Henry approached carefully. "You okay?" She didn't answer at first, then finally a whisper, "He's not supposed to come back." Henry leaned against the wall. "I know." Sarah tightened her grip on the fabric of her jacket. "He always finds a way." Henry sighed. "Not this time." She turned then, her small face set with something too heavy for a child to carry. "You don't know him," she said. "He's good at pretending. He makes people believe him." Henry crouched down beside her, making sure she could see his face. "But I'm good at finding the truth," he said. Sarah held his gaze for a long moment. Then, slowly, she nodded. Henry had never been a man who stepped outside the lines, but for Sarah and Josh, he was willing to break every rule that needed breaking. The first thing he did was dig into Stephen's past. There was a pattern: evictions, gambling debts, multiple failed attempts at rehab, but none of it was recent enough to hold legal weight. That's when Henry made a risky decision. He pulled Stephen's medical records from the hospital database, and what he found changed everything. Stephen's liver was failing. Years of alcohol abuse had eaten away at his body. His kidneys weren't much better. His blood work painted a picture of a man barely holding himself together. This wasn't just about the past anymore. Stephen wasn't fit to take care of children now. Henry had proof. The next morning, Henry met Emily in the hospital cafeteria, a folder of documents in hand. She skimmed the medical records, her expression unreadable. When she finally looked up, her lips pressed into a thin line. "This changes things," she admitted. Henry leaned back. "It proves he's incapable of taking care of them." Emily tapped her fingers against the table. "It proves he's unhealthy, yes, but does it prove he's dangerous?" Henry's frustration flared. "You want to gamble Sarah and Josh's lives on whether or not his sickness makes him dangerous enough." Emily sighed. "You know I don't. But you also know how the system works." Henry closed his eyes briefly, exhaling through his nose. "Then what do we do?" Emily glanced at the papers again. "We don't just go after his health. We need to build a full case. His debts, his living conditions, his past." Henry frowned. "That's going to take time." Emily nodded grimly. "And we don't have much." Sarah never let Josh out of her sight. Even when he was sleeping, she sat beside him, her hand resting lightly against his arm, as if to reassure herself he was still there. But at night, when she thought no one was listening, Henry could hear her whispering. "It's okay," she would murmur softly. "I won't let them take us back, I promise." Henry stood outside the hospital room, listening to her fragile assurances, feeling something tighten in his chest. She was 7. She wasn't supposed to be making promises like that. That was supposed to be his job. The day before the first court hearing, Emily called Henry with a new development. "We have a witness," she said. Henry sat up straighter. "Who?" "A former neighbor. An older woman who lived next door to them before Sarah and Josh ran away." Henry's grip on the phone tightened. "And?" Emily took a breath. She remembers everything. The screaming, the bruises Sarah tried to hide, the way their mother stopped answering the door for weeks before she died. Henry exhaled sharply, his pulse picking up. "That's what we need," he said. Emily hesitated. "There's more." Henry frowned. "What?" Emily's voice was quieter now. "The neighbor said she saw something the night Sarah and Josh ran away." Henry waited. "She saw Sarah carrying Josh out of the apartment, barefoot in the middle of the night. And she saw Stephen stumbling after them, drunk, yelling something about not letting them leave." Henry felt his stomach turn. "So we're not just talking about neglect," he said. "We're talking about something worse." Emily's voice was grave. "Yeah," she said, "we are." Sarah sat in the hospital playroom, though she wasn't playing. She was staring out the window, her arms crossed tightly. Henry sat down beside her. "We found someone who remembers what happened," he said gently. Sarah didn't look at him, but he saw her shoulders tense. "I don't want to talk about it," she said. "You don't have to," Henry said. "But if you ever do." She finally turned to him, her dark eyes sharp, knowing. "You're going to say everything will be okay," she muttered. Henry paused. Then, quietly, he said, "No. I was going to say that you don't have to do this alone." Sarah blinked. For a long moment she didn't speak. Then, slowly, she exhaled. "Good," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Because I'm tired of fighting alone." The battle had begun. But this time, Sarah wasn't fighting it by herself. The morning air was still heavy with the last remnants of rain, the scent of damp pavement lingering in the breeze. St. Michael's Hospital was quieter than usual, as if the world itself was bracing for what was to come. Inside, Sarah sat stiffly in a chair, her small hands curled into fists in her lap. She hadn't spoken much since Emily had told her about the witness, the elderly woman who used to live next door to them. She wasn't sure what scared her more, hearing the truth spoken aloud, or knowing that the past she had tried to escape was now unfolding in front of strangers. Henry watched her carefully from across the small office, noting the way her shoulders tensed every time Emily shifted the papers in front of her. "She's ready to give a statement," Emily said, flipping through her notes. "Her memory is sharp. She remembers details, specific dates, even the way Sarah and Josh used to disappear for hours, only coming back after Stephen passed out." Sarah's breath hitched, but she kept her gaze on the floor. Henry hesitated. "Do you want to hear what she said?" For a long moment, Sarah didn't move. Then finally she whispered, "I already know." They met the witness later that afternoon. The old woman, Mrs. Callahan, was frail but sharp-eyed, the kind of person who had seen too much but forgotten none of it. She sat across from Henry and Emily in a small, sunlit office, her wrinkled hands folded on the table. "I remember them," she said without hesitation. "That little girl," she nodded towards Sarah, who was sitting quietly beside Henry. "She used to hide in my hallway. Sometimes she had that baby with her. I could tell she was trying to keep him quiet, but babies don't know when it's safer to be silent." Sarah's fingers curled into Henry's sleeve. Mrs. Callahan sighed. "I never liked that man. Always coming home late, slamming doors, breaking things. The mother, oh, poor thing," she tried. "But you can't change a man who don't want to be changed." She turned to Sarah then, her gaze softer, sadder. "I'm sorry, sweetheart. I should have done more." Sarah shook her head quickly, blinking against the sudden sting behind her eyes. "You tried," she whispered. Mrs. Callahan nodded once. "I did, but not enough." The courtroom was colder than Henry expected, the kind of sterile, impersonal space that made even the most painful stories sound like mere facts on a page. Stephen sat across from them, dressed in a crisp suit, his expression perfectly rehearsed. He had always known how to wear a mask when it mattered. When the judge addressed him, his voice wavered just the right amount, his posture carefully controlled. "I made mistakes," he admitted, voice low, trembling just enough to sound genuine. "But I've changed. I want my family back." Sarah stiffened beside Henry, her grip on his sleeve tightening. She knew that tone. She had heard it before, soft words masking sharp edges, apologies meant to manipulate. She didn't believe it then. She didn't believe it now. Emily was calm, methodical, presenting the evidence in clear, steady words. The witness statements, the history of neglect, the reports of abuse. Stephen didn't flinch. Then came the medical records. Henry watched as Emily placed them on the table, flipping through the pages one by one. The judge narrowed his eyes as he scanned the reports. "Mr. Caldwell," the judge said, his tone shifting, "it says here that your liver function is failing. You also have severe kidney damage." Stephen's jaw ticked, but he forced a smile. "I've been getting treatment," he said quickly. "I'm taking care of it." Emily didn't let up. "You're on a transplant list," she pointed out, "which means you're in no condition to care for 2 children. You need care yourself." A flicker of frustration flashed in Stephen's eyes. "I can still be a father," he said, a little sharper this time. Henry leaned forward slightly. "No, you can't," he said, his voice calm but firm. Stephen turned his glare onto Henry, but Henry didn't look away. "You couldn't take care of them when you were healthy," Henry continued. "You won't be able to do it now." The silence stretched. For the first time, Stephen's mask cracked. Not much, just a flicker of anger, a flash of something ugly behind his carefully controlled expression. But it was enough. Sarah saw it, and so did the judge. The ruling came quicker than expected. Stephen lost all parental rights. The court declared he was unfit to be their guardian, and Sarah and Josh would remain in protective care. Sarah didn't react at first. She sat frozen as the judge's words settled over her, as if she couldn't quite believe it was over. Then, very slowly, she turned to Henry, her fingers loosened from his sleeve, her small hands falling back to her lap. She exhaled, a quiet, shaky breath, and for the first time in a long time, she wasn't afraid. Stephen was led out of the courtroom, his face twisted in something between anger and disbelief. But before he disappeared through the doors, he turned his gaze to Sarah one last time. She met his eyes, and this time, she didn't look away. Outside the courthouse, the sky was clear. Sarah tilted her face up toward the sunlight, blinking against the brightness. Henry stood beside her, watching her carefully. "Are you okay?" he asked. Sarah was quiet for a long moment. Then, "I don't know," she admitted, "but I think I will be." Henry nodded. "That's enough for now." Sarah glanced up at him then, searching his face for something unspoken. "Are you going to leave too?" The question caught him off guard. Henry crouched down beside her, making sure she could see the truth in his eyes. "No," he said. "I'm not going anywhere." Sarah stared at him for a long moment. Then, for the first time since he met her, she smiled. The past had been unburied, the truth had been spoken, and for the first time, Sarah and Josh had a future worth believing in. The courtroom was colder than Sarah had expected, not just from the air conditioning that buzzed softly overhead, but from the way everything inside it felt distant, sterile, detached, as if the people who sat behind polished desks and typed on computers were simply going through motions, unaware that their decisions could change lives. She sat stiffly beside Henry, her small hands balled into fists in her lap. Josh was asleep next to her, his head resting against her arm, his breathing slow but even. She wasn't sure if she wanted to be here, but she knew she had no choice. The judge cleared his throat, flipping through a thick folder of papers. The sound of shifting documents felt deafening in the silence of the room. Sarah stared at her lap, at the way her fingers dug into the fabric of her jeans. She didn't dare look up. She knew what Stephen's face would look like. Calm, confident, pretending to be something he wasn't. She hated that he was good at it. But she hated more that other people believed him. Henry's voice broke the silence first. "Your Honor," he said, standing with a quiet kind of authority, the kind that made people listen. Sarah finally lifted her head, watching as he stepped forward. "I've worked in hospitals long enough to recognize when someone is capable of taking care of others," Henry continued, "and I can say without hesitation that Stephen Caldwell is not." Stephen barely reacted. Henry didn't let up. He recounted everything: the medical reports, the history of neglect, abuse and abandonment, the witness testimonies, the way Sarah and Josh had been left to fend for themselves after their mother died. He spoke calmly, but his words hit like a hammer. Sarah sat very still, her breath shallow, as she watched the judge listen. When Henry finished, the room fell silent again. The judge studied the papers in front of him, then looked toward Stephen. "You may respond," he said. Stephen sighed, shaking his head slightly, as if he were the one who had been wronged. He stood up slowly, adjusting his tie, his expression carefully crafted. "Your Honor," he said, his voice soft, steady, practiced. "I won't deny that I've made mistakes." Sarah's stomach twisted. She knew what was coming next. "I lost myself for a while," Stephen continued. "After my wife passed, I struggled. I wasn't the father I should have been. But I've changed. I've taken steps to fix my life." His eyes flicked toward Sarah and Josh. "I just want my family back." His voice cracked at the last word, just enough to sound real, and for a split second, Sarah felt fear crawl up her spine. What if the judge believed him? What if they had gone through all of this only to end up right where they started? She gripped Henry's sleeve. He didn't move, but she felt his hand shift slightly, his fingers curling over hers, a silent promise. "It's okay. I won't let him win." The judge exhaled, placing his hands together. Sarah watched, barely breathing, as he turned the page in front of him, eyes scanning the words carefully. Then, finally, "I have reviewed all evidence presented," the judge said. "Based on the witness statements, the medical reports, and Mr. Caldwell's current physical condition, it is clear that he does not meet the requirements necessary to regain custody of Sarah and Josh Caldwell." Stephen stiffened. "The court officially terminates his parental rights." Sarah didn't move. She should have felt relieved. She should have been happy. Instead, her chest felt tight, a strange pressure building up inside her, something too heavy to name. She gripped her jeans tightly, staring at her lap. Josh shifted beside her, murmuring something in his sleep, unaware that their entire world had just changed. She should feel safe. Then why did she feel so empty? The children will remain in protective custody until proper placement is found, the judge continued. The recommended course of action is to place them in a group home under state supervision until permanent guardianship can be arranged. Sarah's head snapped up. Group home? Her breath hitched. She had expected this, hadn't she? She had always known that the state wouldn't just let them live on their own, that someone had to take care of them. But the idea of a home filled with strangers, of being somewhere unfamiliar, of Josh waking up in a place where nothing felt safe. She turned suddenly, looking up at Henry. Her eyes burned. Do we have to go? Henry froze, caught between her desperate gaze and the finality of the ruling. The courtroom emptied out slowly, people filtering through the doors, voices murmuring about legalities and final paperwork. Stephen was escorted out, his expression carefully neutral, but his fists clenched at his sides. He didn't look at Sarah again. She didn't look at him either. Henry knelt beside her. Hey, he said softly. Sarah swallowed, blinking hard. I don't want to go, she whispered. Josh stirred at the sound of her voice, rubbing his eyes sleepily. Henry exhaled, running a hand through his hair. This was supposed to be the moment where everything was okay, where the fight was over, but it wasn't, not for them. Outside, the sky was clear for the first time in days. Sarah stood stiffly, watching as a social worker spoke to Henry, explaining the next steps. Josh clung to her side, still sleepy, his small fingers wrapped around her wrist. A car was waiting to take them to the group home. Sarah knew what was supposed to happen next. She was supposed to get in, she was supposed to go, she was supposed to let go, but instead, she ran. She ran straight to Henry, throwing her arms around him before she could stop herself, before she could think about whether or not she was supposed to. Josh followed instantly, his small hands gripping Henry's coat, his face pressing into his chest. Sarah squeezed her eyes shut. Please, don't let them take us. She didn't mean to say it out loud, but once the words left her mouth, she couldn't stop them. I don't want to go. Henry was very still. The social worker hesitated, shifting awkwardly. Mr. Carter, she started, carefully, it's standard procedure. No, Henry's voice was quiet but firm. Sarah's breath caught. He pulled back just slightly, enough to meet her eyes, enough for her to see something change in his expression. He had spent weeks fighting for her, for Josh, for their safety, but suddenly she realized that wasn't enough for him anymore. He wasn't just fighting for their safety, he was fighting for them, for their place in his life, for their place in his heart. Henry stood up slowly, holding Sarah's hand in one and Josh's in the other. He turned toward the social worker. I want to file for custody. Sarah's breath hitched. The social worker blinked. Henry didn't waver. I'm not letting them go. Sarah didn't know what the future looked like. She didn't know how long it would take for the paperwork to go through, or how many more courtrooms they would have to sit in. But as she stood there, gripping Henry's hand as if letting go would make everything fall apart again, she knew one thing. She wasn't alone anymore. And maybe, just maybe, she never would be again. The morning light was pale, hesitant. It filtered through the hospital windows, stretching across the tile floors like a thing too fragile to last. The air smelled of antiseptic and coffee left too long on the burner, a scent that had somehow become familiar in the weeks that had passed. Henry stood near the entrance of St. Michael's Hospital, watching as Sarah and Josh sat on the waiting room bench, their small backpacks resting at their feet. They weren't talking. Sarah's hands were folded in her lap, her fingers picking at the loose threads on her jacket. Josh sat beside her, legs swinging, his body pressed close as if trying to make himself smaller. The social worker stood a few feet away, speaking quietly into her phone, giving them a moment before they had to go. Henry knew what was supposed to happen next. He was supposed to say goodbye. He was supposed to let them go. Henry cleared his throat, but the words felt wrong before they even left his mouth. Are you ready? Sarah didn't look at him. Josh sniffled, his small fingers twisting the hem of his sweater. Henry exhaled. They weren't ready. Neither was he. The social worker finished her call and approached with a gentle, practiced smile. I know this is hard, she said softly, but the group home is a safe place. There will be other kids, and a good staff. It won't be forever. Sarah nodded stiffly, her jaw tight. Josh clung to her hand, his grip small but desperate. Henry felt something crack inside his chest. He knelt in front of them, his voice softer this time. "It's okay to be scared." Josh blinked up at him, his blue eyes wet, his small face pinched with confusion. "But we don't have to go, right?" Henry's throat tightened. "That's not up to me," he admitted. Sarah finally looked at him, and for the first time he saw it, not just fear, but something worse. Resignation. Like she had already convinced herself that this was just another thing she had no control over. Like she was preparing herself for the goodbye. They stepped outside. The air was crisp, autumn settling in. The car waited at the curb, its doors open, the back seat too big for children who had spent too much of their lives feeling small. Henry walked beside them, his hands in his pockets, trying not to make this harder than it already was. But when they reached the car, Sarah suddenly stopped. She stood still for a long moment, her small shoulders rigid. Then, without warning, she turned, throwing her arms around Henry's waist, clutching his coat with shaking fingers. Her voice was barely a whisper. "I don't want to go." Josh started crying then, soft, hiccuping sobs that turned into full-body shakes. Sarah held on tighter. Henry could feel her heartbeat against his ribs, fast, desperate. The social worker hesitated, shifting uncomfortably. "I know this is difficult," she said gently, "but it's only temporary." Sarah pulled away sharply, stepping back. Her fists clenched at her sides, her breath shaky, her face twisted in something too big for her small body to hold. And then, just like that, she ran. She ran straight to Henry, crashing into him with a force that knocked the air from his lungs. Her arms wrapped around him, so tight it almost hurt, her small hands gripping fistfuls of his shirt. "Please," she whispered, voice breaking. Her next words came out in ragged, choked sobs. "Please, don't let them take us." Henry's breath stalled. Josh ran after her, clinging to his leg, his small fingers fisting into the fabric of Henry's scrubs. The world around them blurred. The car, the social worker, the quiet hum of morning traffic. All that existed was the weight of two small bodies holding on to him as if letting go would tear them apart. The social worker took a hesitant step forward. "Henry!" He didn't move. He couldn't move. Because suddenly the idea of letting them go felt like the worst mistake he could ever make. Because suddenly he understood something he'd been trying to ignore. He had already made his choice. He looked down at Sarah, at the girl who had fought every battle alone until now, at Josh, who had only ever known safety when he was with his sister. And without thinking, without hesitating, without even considering the consequences, Henry tightened his arms around them. And then he looked up. His voice was steady. "They're not going anywhere." The social worker blinked. "Henry," he cut her off. "I'm filing for custody." Sarah stilled in his arms. Josh hiccuped against his chest. The social worker hesitated. "You can't just—" "I can." He took a slow breath. "I will." Sarah tilted her head up slowly, her dark eyes wide, searching his face for the lie that wasn't there. "You mean it?" she whispered. Henry nodded. Sarah's breath hitched. And then, for the first time in a long time, she let herself believe it. The social worker sighed, running a hand through her hair. "It's not that simple. There's a process. Paperwork, hearings. I don't care how long it takes." Henry spoke with a certainty that left no room for argument. "I'm not letting them go." The car pulled away without them. Josh held Henry's hand the entire walk back into the hospital, his small fingers wrapped around Henry's like they had always belonged there. Sarah walked beside them, quiet but lighter, as if something that had been weighing her down had finally been lifted. That night, as Henry sat on the edge of the hospital bed, watching Sarah and Josh curl up under the blanket, a thought settled into his chest. Not fear, not doubt, just certainty. He wasn't just fighting for their safety anymore, he was fighting for their home. And somehow, in the middle of it all, he had found his own. The rain had returned, soft this time, gentle, a whisper against the windows of St. Michael's Hospital. It wasn't the kind of storm that threatened, nor the kind that washed things away. It was steady, patient, as if it had all the time in the world. Inside, Henry stood near the doorway of the hospital room, watching the small figures curled up beneath the thin blankets. Sarah sat on the edge of Josh's bed, her arms wrapped around her knees, her face pressed into them as she tried to stifle her sobs. But she couldn't. The sound broke through the silence, raw, uneven, a kind of crying that wasn't just about sadness, but about everything. Years of fear, of running, of hoping for something that never came, until now. Henry exhaled slowly, stepping forward, sitting carefully in the chair beside them. He didn't speak, not yet. Instead, he just let her cry. Josh stirred in his sleep, shifting slightly, his small fingers instinctively reaching for his sister, even in unconsciousness. Sarah let out a shuddering breath and pulled the blanket higher over him, her hands still shaking. She didn't look at Henry, but when she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I don't know how to not be scared anymore." Henry's chest tightened. It was the most honest thing she had ever said, and he knew there were no easy answers to give her. So instead, he leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. "I don't know how to fix that," he admitted, "but I do know this. You're not alone anymore." Sarah finally turned her head toward him, her dark eyes filled with so much exhaustion, so much disbelief, like she had wanted to believe those words before but had never been able to. Her lips parted slightly as if she wanted to say something. Instead, she let out a shaky breath and just nodded. It wasn't trust, not yet, but it was something close to it. Hours passed, and at some point Sarah finally fell asleep. Her body was still curled protectively beside Josh's, her fingers lightly gripping the edge of his blanket. Henry sat back in his chair, rubbing a hand down his face, exhaustion creeping into his bones. He wasn't just tired, he was drained, but underneath all of it there was something else, something he hadn't let himself feel until now, conviction. He let out a slow breath, then reached for his phone, dialing the one number that mattered most. Emily picked up on the second ring. "It's the middle of the night, Carter," she mumbled, voice thick with sleep. "This better be important." Henry glanced back at the two sleeping children, at the way Sarah's small hand still gripped Josh's blanket even in sleep. "It is," he said quietly. Emily sighed. "What is it?" Henry swallowed, steadying himself. "I want to adopt them." Silence, then a soft inhale on the other end of the line. "Henry?" Emily's voice was softer now, careful. "Are you sure?" Henry's gaze never left Sarah and Josh, at the way they still curled into each other, as if they only knew how to exist when they were holding on to each other. "Yeah," he murmured. "I'm sure." Somewhere outside, the rain continued to fall, but this time, it didn't feel like an ending. It felt like a beginning. The rain came softly that afternoon, tapping against the windows of St. Michael's Hospital like an old friend. It wasn't the kind of storm that threatened or drowned the world in chaos. It was the kind that lingered gently, steady and unshaken, as if it had nowhere else to be. Henry stood by the window, his fingers curled around a mug of coffee that had long since gone cold. Across the room, Sarah sat at the kitchen table, pencil in hand, her brows furrowed in deep concentration as she finished her homework. Josh sat beside her, legs swinging beneath the chair, humming under his breath, lost in the safety of a world that had once been so uncertain. They had been his children for 6 months now, and yet some days it still didn't feel real. The adoption had taken time. Paperwork, hearings, home visits, hoops to jump through, questions to answer, doubt to silence. But in the end, it was done. Sarah and Josh were his, legally, permanently, unconditionally. And though he had never imagined his life turning out this way, he knew with absolute certainty that he wouldn't change a single thing. "Done," Sarah announced, pushing her notebook away with an exaggerated sigh. Josh giggled, resting his chin in his hands. "Did you get the hard ones right?" Sarah shot him a look. "Of course I did." Josh nodded seriously, as if she had just confirmed the most undeniable truth in the world. Henry smiled, watching them settle into something so wonderfully normal. Two children who had once known only survival, now learning what it meant to simply be. A soft rumble of thunder echoed in the distance. Sarah glanced toward the window, watching the way the raindrops chased each other down the glass. She was quiet for a moment. Then, "Henry?" He turned to her. "Yeah?" Sarah tilted her head slightly, her dark eyes thoughtful. "Do you think the rain is someone's tears?" The question hung between them, delicate and weighty all at once. Henry exhaled, his gaze drifting back to the window, to the grey sky, to the storm that had once been a constant in their lives. He thought about the broken little girl who had once stood outside this very hospital, clutching a cardboard sign. He thought about the terrified little boy who had been too weak to breathe on his own. He thought about all the pain, all the loss, all the impossible choices that had led them here. And then he thought about now, about Sarah's steady voice, about Josh's easy laughter, about the way they no longer feared the sound of footsteps behind them, and suddenly the answer was clear. He set his mug down, walking toward them, placing a hand on each of their small shoulders. "No, sweetheart," he said softly, his voice carrying the weight of something unspoken. "Maybe it's someone watching over us." Sarah's fingers curled around his. Josh leaned into his side, and for the first time as the rain continued to fall, they let it, because it wasn't something to run from anymore. It was simply part of the story, and the story wasn't over yet. Life is full of stories that touch the heart. If you believe in love and kindness, please like, share this video and leave a comment to spread the good news.